Hey everyone, watching this YouTube video, we got Ben Shapiro, Adam Carolla testifying in front of Congress about the violence of speaking in front of campuses, because it's dangerous. Oh, I don't want you to see my body. I'm shirtless. I'll just sit up straight. There we go. Alright, but no, this is some real shit though. This guy, Mr. Lawrence, he just said some stuff that pissed me off. So I had to, I started shouting, man. I started shouting.
Mr. Carolla wants to come to campus and do his seething critique of Taylor Swift. I would say have at it. But those aren't the hard cases that we're talking about. Where you do weigh in are precisely cases.
What do you mean they're not the hard cases? Mr. Shapiro has been shouted down, uninvited, violence at things. So what do you mean it's not the hard case? If you think his speech is appropriate, he's engaging in the kind of ideas, a robust debate that we want on college campuses, then why is the reaction the way it is then?
But there shouldn't be that reaction, and what I mean by not being a hard case is that it should not be a hard case for a university administration to protect his speech.
Okay, why wasn't his speech protected? He's saying it's not a hard case to protect his speech. He gets shouted down.
There's no problem with that.
Yeah, it seems to be.
But what I mean by the hard cases is that when you do see a dramatic increase in white supremacist incidents on campuses,
What does that mean?
university administrators have to pay attention.
What does that mean? When you see a increase in white supremacist incidents on campus, you have to pay attention. To what? The speakers they have on campus? What about when there's a dramatic increase of social justice warrior incidents? Did universities take notice? No. They're most of the time they're capitulating to the social justice warrior mob, like at Evergreen University. Some of the rules that the mob made the administrators enforce are still standing. They run that school. The teenagers, the 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20 and 21-year-olds are telling grown adults what to do. I'm sorry.
Particularly when there are people who come from the outside, and the university president has a hard time keeping control of his campus. But that's a different situation for Mr. Carolla.
Mr. Shapiro, you an agitator? Not as far as I'm aware. So I think that some of what's been said does mini-skirt the debate. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I got it right. When you were talking about the Wisconsin law, I believe that law was brought up in direct counter to what happened, and it was people talked about it on the legislature. In direct counter to what happened when I spoke at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where you had a bunch of protesters who stood in front of the stage and obstructed the stage, and then refused to leave. And when I asked the police would they remove the protesters at a certain, they've been going for 15 minutes. By the way, personally, two things just to preface. I have no problem whatsoever with people protesting my speeches. I do have a problem with people who won't actually let me speak. And number two, as far as all the talk about white supremacy, I can speak from experience. Mr. Lawrence, your organization named me the #1 target of anti-Semitism online last year. So I have a trophy in my house, #1 hate Jew in America. So I'm totally familiar with the level of vitriol that's become common in our politics. But one of the things that's a problem, and I think we have to be careful about, is when we say leave it to the administrators, and then the administrators do what they did at UW, which is the police. I said to the police, will you remove these protesters? And the police said, we have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters, we are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters. We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in free speech designed to enrich the debate, but in order to shut down the debate. And there have to be some sort of ramifications for people who are actually committing trespass. I mean, this is not a question of free. Everyone is trying to focus in on this
free speech
and hate speech. But the important part of those phrases is not the first word. It's speech versus crime. So if there's a crime that's being committed, we're all in agreement. If somebody commits a crime and they're speaking of an imminent threat to somebody, of course that's a crime. But that has very little to do with the hate and a lot more to do with the crime as to whether that's prosecuted, because hate speech is not prosecutable, nor should it be policed by the campus. So the fact is that what we are seeing is a conflation between speech and active attempts to obstruct in order to promote the obstruction by some administrators on a few college campuses.
Can I add to that?
Sure can.
I think the bigger problem and what's sort of insidious here is I believe that the administration does not agree.
Hold on, what the fuck is this guy gonna add to Ben Shapiro? The guy just fucking whittles off this beautiful, eloquent fucking thing. What are you gonna fucking, you gonna tell another joke? You gonna tell another fucking story? Hold on now, what is he gonna say?
Shapiro and Ben Shapiro's thoughts and what Ben Shapiro's going to say. So it becomes a tacit agreement. They disagree. They're basically Steeler fans, and he's a Baltimore Ravens fan, and he's going to come up and make a speech, and all the Steeler fans say, well, he should be allowed to, but we're not a fan. And so quietly they go along with it. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a big problem. That everyone agrees on free speech. Everyone agrees that the college campus should be a petri dish of free speech or melting pot or whatever it is, a sea sponge of free speech. But when the administration doesn't agree with what Ben Shapiro has to say, they don't defend his right to say it as vigorously as they would if someone came on who they agreed with. It's quiet, no one ever talks about it, but I believe that's what's going on.
They tell him like they did last week that, oh, there's no venue that will accommodate him in September. Wow. Right? You can't find a place on campus to have him come and address this.
I mean, I think that, if I may for a second, I think that's one of the dangers here is that what we're seeing in many cases is use of what would normally be time, place, and manner restrictions in order to restrict the actual type of speech.
As a pretext.
Yes.
If I might say, responding to points that Mr. Krishnamurti made and also Chairman Jordan, that this really is not such a new phenomenon. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was actually epic violence on campuses, massive shutdowns, outside agitators, students alike, faculty members and administrators imprisoned within their offices, and that gave rise to that fabulous report that Chairman Jordan referred to, the Woodward Report, which I think is responsive to a number of questions that have been raised. What should campus administrators do? Because it really, in concrete terms, spells out the distinctions between speech that should be protected, including vehement protest, and where it crosses the line into coercion and intimidation, where it is important for the university to enforce its own rules. But that's as distinct from government getting into the fray.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized, and we'll relax the time restraints a little bit.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses.
Wonder who it is. Is it the lady? Is this lady going to ask the questions?
Mr. Lawrence, in your written testimony, you talk about white supremacists are engaged in unprecedented outreach.
What the heck is white supremacist shit?
And campuses. What do you believe accounts for the...
I bet you it's Kekistani, and they're misinterpreting it as white supremacy.
What do you believe white supremacist groups are hoping to achieve by the increase in targeting colleges and universities?
I think what they're hoping to accomplish is to influence the next generation of leaders in society, and so they
Too late.
with that in mind,
They're already all red-pilled.
Get a high level of visibility, which they do. Campuses get a high level of attention in the media, in the press, in government, and mostly for good reasons, but I think that raises that as well. And I think to a certain extent we are living in a highly hyper-polarized environment right now, and there is a violence to the vocabulary that comes very
I bet you this guy is just labeling everything that's Republican as white supremacist. That's what they do.
But let me hasten to add that even when those groups come to campus, I still think the answer is more speech, not to restrict. But I do think this is where the job of the administrator becomes very complicated but terribly important, to be a voice of clarity, to say on this campus we believe that all are entitled to come here and have a satisfying learning experience, to be challenged intellectually, to be troubled with ideas, but not to be threatened and not to be stigmatized because of who they are or what they are.
You know, as I indicated in my opening statement, I have been directly involved in numerous, providing security for numerous protests as persons who I agreed with and groups that I didn't exercise their First Amendment rights. So I take this conversation very, very seriously.
Why does she like
You
stare
talked
at Ben
earlier
Shapiro
about
when she like says
kind
that?
of
Hold on, let's go back.
but I didn't exercise their First
Looks
Amendment
writing at
rights,
Ben
so I
Shapiro.
take this conversation very, very seriously. You talked earlier about kind of the complicated and sometimes difficult job of the college administrator who is trying to balance protecting the right to free speech, but also thinking about the welfare and safety and well-being of their students.
Welfare how? Safety
which can
how?
be a difficult line. Could you, or even Dr. Zimmerman, college administrator related?
I've not heard a single demand from any one of those who were present, who were injured or wounded, for restriction of anyone's right to speak their views on any issue. And I just think, you know, I was at the University of Alabama in the mid-1970s. 1965 was the first time an African American was allowed to enroll in the university. It was a dark time in our history. There's no question about it. But in 1976, we elected the first African American president of the Student Government Association. The year before
That it is the obligation.
Not exist.
Or speech I find offensive, but
forbidden speech is anything that a particular person or group of people find.
problem. You'll have people. No, I haven't seen any limiting principle at play at all on college campuses, which is the problem. You'll have people like Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal treated exactly the same way as Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos, and they're poles apart in terms of how they express themselves and many of the views that they hold. So this idea that there is some sort of bright line, this is why I hate, even the term hate speech is really difficult, because it just suggests that if I don't like what you're saying, or if I impute to you an intent that you may not have, then now you're hateful and you should be banned. It seems to me that it would a more effective use of terminology would say speech I find insulting or speech I find offensive. But the idea of hate speech itself, there are certain types of speech I think we can all agree are objectively hateful, but I don't think that there is any limiting principle at play from a lot of administrators, because I think that they use that club of hate speech in order to cudgel people with whom they disagree. They just say, okay, I don't like what you're saying now, and that's hate speech. And microaggression culture contributes to this. I mean, literally on campuses, students will be told that if you say to another student, where are you from, that this is some sort of microaggression, that this is a minor form of hate speech. If you say, where are you from, because you're implying they're not from here. Well, I mean, of course you're not from here. I mean, I assume you weren't born on this spot, but it doesn't matter. You know, the idea that you're going to broaden out terminology in order to prohibit groups that you don't like or ideas that you don't like, I would much prefer that if we're going to move the ratchet in any one direction, let's move the ratchet in favor of more speech. And I agree, of course, with Mr. Lawrence that it's perfectly appropriate if an administrator wants to say that I personally disagree, the university doesn't agree with the views that are being espoused by a particular speaker. That's perfectly appropriate. But you know, sometimes there are gray areas in terms of what the university is doing. When Mr. Lawrence was at Brandeis University, Ayan Hirsi Ali was uninvited from the university because of blowback from some of the students. I mean, is that a case of her free speech rights being violated? It's a private university, but if it were a public university, would that be a case of her free speech rights being violated because administrators decided not to stand up for those because students were upset? I mean, this is why I think that the notion that there is some sort of grand intelligentsia running the universities who are capable of discriminating between hate speech and normal speech and should be sitting atop a hill somewhere under a palm tree like a Qadi dispensing justice on a case-by-case basis, I think it's nonsense, and I don't think that they have any rational standards they apply.
I'll just conclude with this, Mr. Chairman, that I think this hearing is very important. I think it's the main thing that students ought to get, and all of us ought to get, is to deny ourselves access to other people's views, is to deny ourselves furthering our own education. This is how you learn. And I would like to compliment Mr. Carolla on his metaphors, football, and hardware. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. When Mr. Shapiro was given his example about asking the question and it being perceived as a microaggression, asking the question, where are you from, I noticed the students in the audience all nodding their heads. And so in our subsequent hearings, we're gonna look to get some students here who can give us some firsthand knowledge of what it's like from their perspective on these particular campuses. And with that, I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois for her questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find this conversation very interesting. I used to work on the college campus. I was the director of Minority Student Services for Bradley University, and I'm now on the Board of Trustees of Bradley. That's my...
Director of Minority Student Services. Jeez, man. Why do minority students get special services? Unless you're like speaking a second language. I don't feel like it's justified. All the services should be available to all students. Otherwise, I'm a minority too.
Alma mater. And something you said, Mr. Zimmerman, we did start, you know, we had student orientation, and as part of the orientation, the students went through diversity training and diversity orientation. As freshmen, they had to go through a class for half of the semester. Mr. Lawrence, Anti-Defamation League, came to the campus. That's where I cut my teeth. I'm a diversity trainer, and we did a campus of difference. And one thing I wanted to say also, I know on the outside it may look like we don't get along, but I just hosted something I called Breaking Bread, and there were 75 of us, Democrats and Republicans, that ate together. And not that probably Mr. Meadows, the head of the Freedom Caucus, and I probably never vote alike, but we are very close. You can ask him, and Mr. Palmer and I bring him popcorn from Illinois. So we do get along. We do get to a goal, but Palmer, what he experienced on, we need support. So first on that adult support.
Another
impact what he went through has on him, but how can we support students?
Well, I think the more we talk with one another, understand, right, that needs to be demonstrated more openly. In terms
And
that not such
people. I thought, what are the odds? I've been here an hour and already met somebody I know. I turned around and waved at the car. Be protected.
to raise new.
Corolla, I know King George may have found this to be insightful, but do you
Is
find
he a
it
basketball player? I don't keep up. On the Kings. I was just having a thought. No, I'm sorry, continue your
No, I just want to know, is this a threatening document? Does this cross the threshold?
Not unless there's a knife hidden inside of it.
Right.
No. But as I was hearing everyone speak, I never went to college. There's something I would like to touch on very quickly, which is going through diversity training, going to college. We're all sitting here, first off, under the assumption that 100% of kids go to college. I didn't know anyone who went to college, so I had to figure out a way to be a decent human being, not to be racist, not to be filled with hate, to be tolerant, minus college. I think that starts at home. So if you get to 18 or 19,
Who belong to Young Americans for Liberty, they said if you just filled out the paperwork, if you'd stood 100 feet over there instead of where you're standing, and if you'd done it at this time, we would have allowed you to hand out our nation's founding document. Can you speak to how time, manner, and place restrictions are being abused?
So most obviously, UC Berkeley did that with Ann Coulter, where they kept moving around her room and they kept saying they didn't have rooms available. They said the same thing to me a week ago. There was some public outcry, and now they're offering some rooms, which I hope that event goes forward. It's not rare. They do this a lot. A private university that did it was DePaul University. I was threatened with arrest if I set foot on campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for ideological discrimination, because if Ta-Nehisi Coates wants to speak on these campuses, there's not going to be any problem. The administrators will make certain that time, place, and manner restrictions don't get in the way. And this is why I say, saying that the discretion of administrators is wonderful is all well and good, except that they very often are attempting to achieve a particular political end by using means that are normally legitimate. And that's definitely a dangerous thing. If you don't mind, I have a quick note on something that I think it was Mr. Lawrence was saying earlier about the damage that's done to students by various things that happen on campus, by threats of violence and this sort of thing. And obviously, everyone I think agrees that what happened to Taylor is unacceptable. But one of the things that I think should also be pointed out is we have a lot of other students in the crowd and administrators who spend an enormous amount of time pushing stuff like white privilege means that you must accept that you are subordinate in terms of your view because of identity. This also has some lasting damage with regard to First Amendment exercise and with regard to how people perceive the freedom of the country. And I understand that this is universally held belief among university educators that we have to accept the guilt of particular races or particular sexual orientations for discrimination that's happened in the past. But when you teach a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old people this, you shouldn't be surprised when, number one, they go into hiding with their viewpoint, or number two, they become frustrated. It's an absurdity to suggest that you can tell people that their viewpoints are out of line because of their identity. At the same time, you're telling other people that their viewpoints are completely in line because of their identity, and that any assault on their senses must be protected or prevented at any cost.
Well, I would just like to point out in closing that the group, Young Americans for Liberty, that is handing out constitutions on campuses all across the country, has changed free speech restrictions on 25 campuses just by handing out this document, not by setting fires because they didn't like the speaker or throwing rocks through windows, but by handing out this constitution. And I am inspired that there are young people who are inspired by this document, and it should never be illegal to hand out this document.
Well said, Mr. Massey. Real quick, Ms. Strawson, is Mr. Shapiro right? Are most of the anti-speech activities going on campuses targeted towards conservatives and libertarians?
Certainly the well-publicized ones have been. And I can't speak for campuses across the country, but I go back to an opening point that I made, which was best summarized in the title of a book by Nat Hentoff.
But I just wanted to answer. I can't. We'll come back to that. But I just wanted to respond to Mr. Shapiro's point. I mean, that's my understanding as well, and I'll be.
Those are the well-publicized incidents, and it would be consistent with what surveys show about the prevailing beliefs on campus, that the majority of students are on the liberal end of the political spectrum. The majority of faculty members are on the liberal end of the spectrum. So they would be more likely to be offended by
Professor Raskin, you're smiling.
Speakers.
You find that shocking too, don't you? The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the entire panel.
This lady is going to be a hoot.
Speech that hurts is part and parcel of living in a democratic free speech society. It pains me, I have to say, when I hear of African American students in particular claiming about hurt feelings when it comes to speech. I say as a black woman and ask them to remember that Frederick Douglass, and I'm pleased that this committee has just passed a bill that will allow Douglass's bicentennial to be commemorated, that at the same time that African Americans were enslaved, Frederick Douglass was able in even that society to denounce slavery all over the United States. Mrs. Shapiro, I dare say I've had the opportunity to defend people who were even more controversial than you are. I was assistant legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. It was a small office, and I had a memorable opportunity to argue before the Supreme Court a so-called prior restraint case. That was a case where, as a matter of fact, it was in Princess Anne County. At that time, I lived in New York, Princess Anne County, Maryland. And
This lady's... Oh man, this she's just going over her highlight reel. Let me tell you about the time I was in front of the Supreme Court and I won the case. Let me tell you about it.
Proto-9/11 Nazi racist party came in that county and gave a speech of the kind you might expect, that denounced blacks and Jews and anybody else they could think of. Well, the state's attorney went into court and got an injunction against their ability to speak the next day. And that case was appealed all the way. I argued the case in the Supreme Court, not as it was appealed up. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that those vile words could be spoken without being censored ahead of time. In essence, this kind of activity in the country and on the campus is intended to have some kind of chilling effect, to keep people from wanting to speak at all. The Republican-led assembly in Wisconsin has taken a stab at what to do about this, because I don't think we want to encourage hateful speech. And I appreciate what Professor Zimmerman and Mr. Lawrence have said about the anecdotes to hate speech. But if you leave this to legislatures, they have only the law at their disposal. Now, in Wisconsin, the state assembly there passed the...
Just want to say, that was a great quote this lady just whipped out there. Miss Norton. I like that. This lady. I like her a lot. Legislatures only have the power of law at their disposal.
The bill recently passed a bill that would require disciplinary action, and that action could be suspension or expulsion. This is how they framed what would get you suspension or expulsion. Any student who engages in indecent, profane, boisterous, obscene, unreasonably loud, or other disorderly conduct that interferes with the free speech, free expression of the others. Every Democrat voted against this. What kind of polarization is this? I'm glad to see we don't have it in this committee. Every Democrat voted against that. Every Republican voted for that. The state assembly, by the way, was not shy in making clear what their purpose was. It was to suppress the campus protests that they had seen over that time. Ms. Strawson, I read your written testimony where you give a wonderful expository about and et cetera, be the concerns.
Said, one person's vulgarity is another person's lyric. One person's indecent, profane speech is somebody else's poetic speech. One person's unreasonably loud speech is somebody else's clearly audible speech. The reason why we do not allow government to enforce these vague standards is that they depend on subjective value judgments, which can turn on nothing other than the political preferences of the enforcing authorities, which is exactly what we're all complaining about. We need to have clear, objective standards relating to demonstrable, serious harm, such as violence or threats, to constrain the discretion so as not to punish disfavored ideas. Now, Congresswoman Norton, I don't know if you got to the appendix to my testimony, but it includes a very old but still timely, sadly, law review article which quotes a certain Eleanor Holmes Norton way back in 1990 who said, and this is exactly on point, it is technically impossible to write an anti-speech code that cannot be twisted against speech nobody means to bar. It has been tried and tried and tried. So you answered your own question very eloquently.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I should end with that.
And on a high note there, that's great. Yeah, thank you. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Not that anyone.
Them because it's my birthday and my parents are out in Statuary Hall. And so I'm a professor. I see a lot of young people out there. It's great to see you. Raise your hand if you're young. For sitting here, witness question said, we got to learn to be good. And that right there sums it up. And I'm going to ask the college presidents how we ground our philosophical statements. That'll be my question, right? So they can give a cursory view of Western Civ in the 30 seconds I leave you at the end. But I have a famous painting in my office with Plato pointing up, right? What is the good? He thought it was up there in the realm of the forms. And Aristotle's pointing down. And no one has resolved that question philosophically in 2,400 years. There is no definition of the good. That's what makes it crucially important that we do the liberal arts education and allow all views to be heard from 2,400 years of human history. And on that note, I hope we all agree. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have spoken about atrocities that have occurred in Western Civ. I totally agree with them. That's not what this is about today. But it's about teaching these first principles. Everyone's talking about shared values today. I'm not sure if there are any shared values today. The guy, if you want to read a good book, read Alistair McIntyre. He'll start off on the good, right? You probably heard of him. But his book is called Which Rationality, Whose Justice? Same question, right? Whose justice, which rationality, and what is the good? And we don't have answers to that right now. So your generation better get moving. The liberal arts I started teaching about 20 years ago, we went from liberalism. I'm a 19th century liberal, right? They call me a right-wing knuckle dragger in the newspaper, right? But I'm a classic. I believe in Adam Smith and James Madison, the author of the Constitution. And liberals, my liberal colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle, always used to respect my view 20 years ago. That shifted in academia in the last 20 years. Now it's the hard left, and they're following a philosophy called deconstruction. They're ripping apart the foundations of the country. The Judeo-Christian tradition, the rule of law, and free markets are under attack by the left, not my Democrat friends I go to church with. That's a distinction. And if you ask them to ground their definition of the good or name a philosopher that undergirds their thinking, they can't do it. So make sure you young people ask your professors, when they're spouting off, say, name a philosopher. And if they can't do it, write about it in the student newspaper, because it's an embarrassment. And so I went to Princeton Seminary. The seminary voluntarily moved itself across the tracks because we don't believe in forcing religion on other people. That's the great debate, right? So we've had the Enlightenment Project. We tried to ground reality in human reason alone. Worked great in the sciences. But in the moral realm, it failed, right? Jefferson, Immanuel Kant was kind of the end of the Enlightenment Project. And the moral vision failed because they could not tell you why it is that human beings are worthy of dignity in the first place. But our shared values were delivered in the Declaration was fairly clear. We have inalienable rights that come from our Creator. Wow, there's a shocker. Ask your leftist professors if they believe in those shared values, those inalienable rights, right, that precede the existence of government, that come from our Creator. And boy, there you have it all, right? So that has been rejected by the left. In K-12 education, I'm sad to report the kids are not taught any system of ethics for the first 13 years of their education. And then in college, they're taught leftism.